The knock came at 9:14 p.m. It was a soft, hesitant sound against a heavy oak door that usually only opened for high-level syndicate meetings or federal warrants. Alejandro Cortez, a man who controlled the city's underworld with a hand of iron, glanced at the security monitor. He expected a threat, a bribe, or a betrayal, but the screen showed something impossible. A girl in a bright red delivery cap, clutching a plain brown bag to her chest as if it were a shield. She was at the wrong house. She was in the heart of a lion's den. She was standing on the threshold of a man who had long ago buried his capacity for mercy. Alejandro's head of security reached for his sidearm, but Alejandro raised a single hand, stopping him in his tracks. He didn't know why, but the way the girl adjusted her cap, a small, nervous gesture, tugged at a memory he had spent 20 years trying to drown. He stood up, ignored the confused looks of his lieutenants, and opened the door himself. "You have the wrong address," he began, his voice like grinding stone. The girl Lena looked up, her face a mask of exhaustion and panic. "I am so sorry," she stammered, stepping back into the shadows. "The app, it glitched. I didn't mean to disturb you." She turned to leave, and that's when the porch light caught it, a glint of silver at her throat. A hand-carved locket. Alejandro's breath stilled. He had seen death. He had orchestrated ruin, but he had never seen this. It was the exact heirloom his younger sister, Alina, was wearing the day she vanished into thin air 2 decades ago. His men froze as the most feared man in the city suddenly gripped the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. His mask of stone didn't just crack, it shattered. "Wait," he whispered, his voice trembling with a desperation no one had ever heard. "That locket, where did you get it?" Lena didn't answer. She couldn't. She was staring at a man whose eyes were wide with a psychological collapse she didn't understand. But Alejandro didn't see a delivery girl anymore. He saw a ghost. And what he discovered about that locket in the next 60 seconds would burn his entire empire to the ground. Stick around until the very end, because the truth Alejandro found behind that simple mistake will make your heart stop and start again. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment below. What would you do if a stranger held the key to your darkest secret? Now let's dive in. The iron gates of the Cortez estate did not merely keep the world out. They announced that the world beyond them was irrelevant. Alejandro Cortez sat in his study, a room that smelled of old leather, expensive tobacco, and the cold, sterile scent of filtered air. The walls were lined with monitors that flickered with the silent movements of men in tactical gear patrolling the perimeter. Alejandro was a man who lived in the center of a spiderweb, feeling every vibration, every threat, and every shift in the city's dark pulse. At 48, he had reached a level of power where he no longer needed to raise his voice to be heard, yet his silence was more terrifying than any scream. He sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of obsidian, his dark hair slicked back with military precision, his eyes fixed on a ledger that detailed the movements of ships he had never seen and lives he would never touch. His life was a masterpiece of control. Every variable was accounted for, every loyalty was tested, and every door was locked from both sides. He had built this fortress not just to protect his body, but to house the void where his heart used to be. For 20 years, Alejandro had moved through the world as a ghost of the man he was supposed to become, a man whose soul had been severed the day his sister, Alina, vanished into the humid heat of a summer afternoon. He had been 25, a rising soldier who thought he was invincible, until the one person who mattered was taken because he had looked away for a single second. Since then, he had stopped looking away. He saw everything. He anticipated everything. The knock on the door was not a knock. It was a timid, uneven tapping, a sound so out of place in the fortress of the Cortez syndicate that it felt like a breach of the laws of physics. Alejandro's hand, which had been poised to sign a document, froze. In this house, people didn't knock. They announced themselves via encrypted intercoms. They were buzzed through 3 layers of security. They were searched and vetted and shadowed. This sound was organic, hesitant, and entirely human. On the security monitor to his right, a camera angle shifted. At the massive front entrance, a girl stood. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s, her slim frame looking fragile against the backdrop of the reinforced steel and stone. She was wearing a bright red delivery uniform, the color a jarring, violent splash against the muted grays and blacks of the estate. A cap was pulled low over her eyes, and she was clutching a brown paper delivery bag to her chest as if it were a life preserver. She looked at her phone, her brow furrowed in a mix of confusion and mounting dread, then looked back at the house number etched into the stone pillar. "Boss," a voice crackled over the intercom. It was Victor, the head of security, a man whose neck was as thick as Alejandro's thigh. "We have a trespasser at the main entrance, a delivery girl. The perimeter sensors didn't flag her because she came through the service gate during the laundry truck's exit. It was a glitch. We're handling it now." On the screen, two men in black suits appeared from the shadows of the portico. They didn't draw their weapons, not yet, but their body language was aggressive, a predatory closing of the distance. They moved with the synchronized grace of wolves. The girl, Lena, jumped at the sight of them, her shoulders tensing, her knuckles whitening around the paper bag. She began to stammer, her lips moving in a frantic explanation that the silent cameras couldn't capture. Alejandro watched as Victor stepped into the frame. He reached for the girl's arm, his hand large enough to crush her humerus. This was the protocol. Anyone who breached the perimeter was to be detained, interrogated, and removed. In Alejandro's world, a mistake was often just a cover for a reconnaissance mission. A delivery girl could be a courier for a rival family, a distraction for a sniper, or a carrier of a biological agent. He should have looked away. He should have let Victor do his job. But then the girl adjusted her cap. It was a small, nervous flick of the wrist, a gesture intended to shield her eyes from the harsh glare of the security lights. As she did, her head tilted back and the light caught something at the base of her throat. Alejandro's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, his face inches from the high-definition monitor. He hit a key on the obsidian desk, zooming the camera in until the pixels screamed. It was a glint of silver, a small, hand-carved locket shaped like a weeping willow. The air in the study suddenly felt very thin. Alejandro felt a cold, electric shock travel down his spine, a sensation he hadn't felt in 2 decades. His pulse, usually a steady, low hum, began to hammer against his ribs with a violence that made his vision blur. He knew that locket. He had spent 3 months' wages as a young man to have it commissioned. He had watched the jeweler's hands tremble as he etched the name Elena into the back of the silver. He had placed it around his sister's neck on her 16th birthday, promising her that as long as she wore it, he would always find her. "Stop," Alejandro said. He didn't use the intercom. He stood up, the chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a dying gasp. He moved with a speed that defied his age, his black suit a blur as he tore through the hallway. His men in the corridor froze as their boss, a man who rarely left his inner sanctum, charged toward the front door. They had seen him order executions with a flick of his wrist. They had seen him walk through a hail of glass during an ambush without blinking. But they had never seen him look like this. They had never seen Alejandro Cortez look terrified. He reached the foyer just as Victor was about to drag the girl toward the security office. The heavy oak door swung open with a bang that echoed like a gunshot. "Let her go," Alejandro commanded. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a low, vibrating growl that carried the weight of a mountain. Victor stopped, his hand still gripped around Lena's upper arm. He looked at Alejandro, his eyes wide with confusion. "Boss, she breached the—" "I said let her go." Alejandro's eyes were locked on the girl. Victor recoiled, stepping back as if he had been struck. The other guards followed suit, melting back into the shadows, their hands dropping away from their holsters. The girl, Lena, was trembling so violently that the paper bag made a dry, rustling sound. She looked up at Alejandro, and for a moment the world simply ceased to exist. Alejandro stood on the threshold of his kingdom, looking at the girl who had knocked on the wrong door. Up close, the resemblance was subtle but haunting. She had the same high cheekbones, the same slight curve to her jaw, and the same wide, expressive eyes that Alina had possessed. But it was the locket that anchored him to the spot. It hung there, a silver ghost against her skin, mocking the 20 years of silence that had nearly destroyed him. I'm so sorry, Lena whispered. Her voice was thin, a fragile thread of sound that barely reached his ears. The app, it glitched. I was supposed to go to 1420 Oakwood, not 1402. I didn't realize until I saw the gates. I just wanted to deliver the order and leave. Please, I don't want any trouble. She held out the brown paper bag as if it were an offering to a vengeful god. Alejandro didn't look at the bag. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the locket. He reached out, his hand trembling, a movement so uncharacteristic that Victor instinctively moved forward to support him, only to be waved back by a sharp, jagged motion of Alejandro's other hand. Alejandro's fingers hovered inches from the silver. He could see the tarnish in the grooves of the willow branches. He could see the way the chain had been mended with a piece of wire that didn't match. This wasn't a replica. This wasn't a coincidence. This was the piece of his soul that had been ripped out in 2004. "Where did you get this?" Alejandro asked. His voice was no longer that of a mafia boss. It was the voice of the 25-year-old boy who had failed his sister. Lena's eyes welled with tears. She tried to step back, but the wall of the portico stopped her. "It's my mother," she said, her voice cracking. "She's sick. She gave it to me to sell if the bills got too high, but I couldn't let it go. It's the only beautiful thing we own." Alejandro felt the mask of stone he had worn for 2 decades finally shatter. The cracks ran deep, splitting his composure, his power, and his history. He looked at the girl, the niece he never knew he had, and then he looked past her into the dark, sweltering streets of the city he thought he owned. He realized then that his empire was a hollow shell, a monument to a lie. His sister hadn't just disappeared. She had been nearby all along, living in the shadow of the monster he had become. "Victor," Alejandro said, his eyes never leaving Lena's face, "get the car and bring a medical team, not the syndicate's doctors, real ones, the best in the city." "Boss," Victor asked, his hand moving toward his radio, "where are we going?" Alejandro looked at the delivery girl, at the mistake that had just undone his entire life. He reached out and gently took the paper bag from her hands, his touch almost reverent. "We're going to find her mother," Alejandro said. He stepped out of the fortress and into the night, the king of shadows finally following the light of a single silver locket. He didn't know what he would find, and he didn't know if he could be forgiven. All he knew was that, for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't just arriving as a boss. He was arriving as a brother, and the city of Oakhaven was about to learn that there was nothing more dangerous than a man who had finally found something worth losing his empire for. The cool night air of the estate, usually a refreshing reprieve from the stifling heat of the city, now felt like a vacuum, sucking the oxygen from Alejandro's lungs. He stood on the threshold of his fortress, his hand outstretched but frozen, as if touching the locket would cause the apparition before him to dissolve into smoke. The delivery girl, Lena, was trembling so violently that the red fabric of her uniform seemed to ripple. To her, this was a moment of mortal peril. She was a trespasser in the sanctuary of a man who owned the police and the politicians. She didn't know that she was currently the only person in the world who could make Alejandro Cortez bleed without using a blade. "Stay still," Alejandro murmured, though it was less a command and more of a plea. His fingers, calloused from years of handling steel and heavy decisions, finally closed around the silver locket. The metal was warm from her skin, a jarring contrast to the icy numbness that had settled in his chest. He turned the small, heart-shaped piece of jewelry over with agonizing slowness. His vision blurred for a second, the harsh lead floodlights of the portico reflecting off the tarnished surface like a blinding flash of the past. He wiped the surface with his thumb. his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. And there it was. The engraving was faint, worn down by 20 years of being clutched in fearful palms and hidden beneath cheap clothing, but the elegant, sweeping script was unmistakable. Elena. Underneath the name, the date, 06/14/2004, stared back at him like an accusation. It was the last day he had seen her. The day the world had turned gray and stayed that way. Alejandro felt a roar of static in his ears, a psychic white noise that drowned out the hum of the city and the heavy breathing of his guards. The Elena on the silver wasn't just a name. It was a ghost that had haunted every shadow of his empire, a reminder of the one thing his millions couldn't buy and his soldiers couldn't find. "Where is she?" Alejandro asked. His voice was a jagged rasp, stripped of its usual authority. He looked up from the locket and into Lena's eyes. He saw the same amber flecks in her irises that he saw every morning in the mirror. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow to the solar plexus. This wasn't just a delivery girl. This was his blood. This was the living evidence of a life he had been denied. Lena's breath hitched in a sob she could no longer suppress. "She's at home. In the apartment. She's sick, please. She didn't do anything. She doesn't even know I'm here. I took the extra shift because we needed the medicine. The landlord was going to lock the door." Alejandro's grip on the locket tightened, the silver biting into his palm. The irony was a bitter, acidic coat in his throat. He had spent 2 decades scouring the globe, sending mercenaries to Eastern Europe and investigators to South America, convinced that his sister had been spirited away to some unreachable corner of the earth. He had built a multi-million-dollar surveillance network to catch a glimpse of her face in a crowd. And all the while, she had been right here, drowning in the poverty of the very city he claimed to rule. She had been surviving on the scraps of the world he had helped create, while he sat in a mahogany-lined study, mourning a ghost that was breathing the same smog-filled air as he was. "Victor," Alejandro called out, his voice regaining a terrifying, crystalline focus. The head of security stepped forward, his face a mask of professional neutrality that couldn't quite hide his utter bewilderment. He had seen Alejandro order the destruction of entire city blocks, but he had never seen him look at a piece of jewelry as if it were a holy relic. "Yes, boss." "The girl stays with me," Alejandro said. He reached out and placed a hand on Lena's shoulder, not to restrain her but to steady himself. "Get the SUV. Now. I want the tactical team in the lead car and the medical unit behind us. We are going to the address on her delivery app." "Boss, we haven't swept the route," Victor protested, his instinct for safety overriding his fear for a split second. "It's 1402 Oakwood. That's in the flats. It's hostile territory. The Varga family has been sniffing around those blocks for weeks. It's not safe for you to go in without a full detail and a scouting report." Alejandro turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Victor, with a ferocity that made the large man take a half step back. It was the look of a man who had already burned his life to the ground and was simply waiting for the wind to catch the embers. "I don't care if the devil himself is waiting on that corner, Victor. Move. Now, or I will drive the car myself." Victor didn't argue further. He barked orders into his lapel radio, and within seconds the courtyard erupted into a frenzy of activity. The silent, low-slung black vehicles roared to life, their headlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of predatory beasts. The guards who had been standing in the shadows of the foyer scrambled into their positions, their movements tight and professional, though their eyes remained fixed on the girl in the red cap. Alejandro looked back at Lena. She was staring at him with a mixture of terror and a budding, desperate hope that she didn't dare give voice to. He saw the way she looked at the locket in his hand, and he realized with a pang of sorrow that she had no idea who he was. To her, he was just the monster on the hill, the legend that mothers used to scare their children into staying quiet. "I'm not going to hurt you, Lena," Alejandro said, his voice softening into a register that felt alien to his throat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean linen handkerchief, offering it to her. "And I'm not going to let anyone else hurt you ever again. Do you understand?" Lena took the handkerchief with a trembling hand, nodding silently. She looked at the paper bag he was still holding, the $12 delivery that had triggered the collapse of the Cortez syndicate. "The food. It's going to get cold," she whispered, a small, absurd concern in the face of a life-shattering revelation. Alejandro looked at the bag and let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "The food doesn't matter, Lena. Nothing matters except getting to your mother." He guided her toward the lead SUV, his hand firm but gentle on her arm. As he stepped away from the oak doors of his estate, he felt the heavy weight of his history falling away. For 20 years he had been the king of shadows, a man defined by what he had lost. But as he looked at the silver locket glinting in the moonlight, he realized that the Alina on the back wasn't a memory anymore. It was a destination. The world had stopped the moment he saw that engraving. The business deals, the territory disputes, the millions of dollars in untraceable accounts, it all felt like ash in his mouth. He had been a man of stone, but the stone had finally cracked, revealing the raw, bleeding heart of the brother he had tried to kill off decades ago. As the motorcade tore out of the gates and onto the winding road that led down into the sprawling, neon-lit chaos of Oakhaven, Alejandro sat in the back of the armored vehicle, his eyes fixed on the silver willow in his palm. He didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like a man who was finally, after a lifetime of searching, finding his way back to the only light he had ever known. He knew that by the time the sun rose, the Cortez syndicate would be changed forever. He knew that his enemies would see this as a weakness, a chink in the armor they had been trying to pierce for years. He didn't care. Let them come. Let the Vargas and the Federals and the traitors within his own ranks try to stop him. He had spent 20 years in a tomb of his own making, and now that he had seen the name of his sister on a piece of silver, he was ready to burn the entire city to the ground just to hear her say his name one more time. The locket felt heavy in his hand, a silver trigger that had just fired the first shot in a war for his own soul. As the lights of the city blurred past the tinted windows, Alejandro Cortez leaned forward, his jaw set, his eyes burning with a fire that hadn't been seen in Oakhaven for 2 decades. The mistake was over. The mission had begun. And the delivery girl who had knocked on the wrong door was about to lead him to the only truth that mattered. The interior of the armored SUV was a pressurized cabin of silence, a stark contrast to the roar of the high-performance engines and the screech of tires as the motorcade carved its way through the winding roads of the hills. Alejandro sat in the shadows of the rear bench, the only light coming from the faint, blue glow of the dashboard instruments and the passing street lamps that flickered across his stone-carved features. Beside him, Lena sat as far away as the seat allowed, her small frame pressed against the door. She looked like a trapped bird, her eyes darting between the tinted glass and the man who held her mother's locket with the reverence of a saint holding a relic. The paper bag sat between them on the premium leather, a mundane reminder of the $12 mistake that had upended the hierarchy of Oakhaven. Alejandro did not look at her with the predatory gaze his enemies feared. Instead, his eyes were anchored to the silver in his palm, his thumb tracing the Alina engraving with a rhythmic, obsessive motion. He was a man suspended between 2 lives, the ruthless kingpin who had just been presiding over a ledger of death, and the grieving brother who had just been resurrected by a piece of jewelry. He knew he was terrifying her. He knew that to her, the silence was a prelude to a sentence. He needed to speak, but his throat felt as though it were filled with the very ash his empire was becoming. "Lena," he said finally. The name felt strange on his tongue, a soft sound in a world of hard consonants. The girl flinched, her breath catching in a jagged sob. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll give the money back. I'll tell the company it was my fault. Just please, please don't hurt my mama. She doesn't even know I took the locket. She keeps it under her pillow. She says it's the only thing that proves she was once someone who was loved." The words cut through Alejandro's armor with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The only thing that proves she was once someone who was loved. He closed his eyes, and for a second, he wasn't in a multi-million-dollar vehicle. He was in a dusty backyard in 2004, watching a girl with the same amber eyes laugh as she swung from a willow tree. "I am not going to hurt her, Lena," Alejandro said, his voice dropping into a low, steady register. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. This locket, I know where it came from. I know who made it. And I knew the girl who wore it before it belonged to your mother." Lena's trembling slowed, curiosity momentarily eclipsing her terror. She turned her head slightly, her face pale in the strobe-like flickers of the city lights. You knew my mother, before the sickness." "I knew a girl named Alina," Alejandro whispered, the name sounding like a prayer. "Tell me about her. Tell me how she came to have this. Tell me everything you remember her saying about where she came from." Lena swallowed hard, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the hem of her red delivery shirt. "She doesn't talk about the before time much. She says it's like a dream she woke up from and forgot. But sometimes when the fever is high, she talks about a house with a big iron gate. She talks about a brother who used to bring her wild strawberries in the summer. She calls him Alejo." Alejandro's knuckles turned white. Alejo. The nickname he hadn't heard in 20 years. The nickname only one person in the world was allowed to use. He felt a sudden, violent surge of hope so intense it was indistinguishable from pain. He had spent 2 decades believing Alina was a victim of a rival's bullet or a casualty of a cold street. But the before time Lena described was his own childhood. "She told me she had to leave," Lena continued, her voice gaining a fragile strength. "She said a man in a dark suit told her that if she stayed, her brother would die. She said she was sold to pay a debt she didn't owe. She spent 20 years hiding in the flats, moving every time someone looked at her too long. She's lived in the shadows because she thought the shadows were the only thing keeping her family safe." "Sold?" Alejandro's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. The interrogation had shifted. It was no longer about confirming Lena's identity. It was about uncovering the architecture of a betrayal that had lasted a generation. "Who sold her, Lena? Did she ever give you a name, a face?" "No," Lena whispered, tears fresh on her cheeks. "She just said the crow. She said the crow took her to a place with no windows and told her she was a ghost now. She lived as a ghost for 20 years, Mr. Cortez. She worked 3 jobs until her lungs started to fail. She never bought anything for herself. Just that locket. She said as long as she had it, she wasn't truly dead." Alejandro felt a cold, crystalline fury settle over his heart. The crow. It was the call sign of Silas Varga, the man who had mentored him, the man who had stood by his side at his father's funeral and promised to help him find his sister. Varga, the elder statesman of the syndicate, had been the one who led the investigation into Alina's disappearance. He had been the one who comforted a grieving 25-year-old Alejandro, while secretly pocketing the profit from the girl he had sold into the very trafficking ring the syndicate protected. The mistake of the delivery girl wasn't just a glitch in an app. It was the hand of fate pulling back the curtain on a 20-year lie. Alejandro realized that his entire career, his rise to power, his ruthless expansion, his very identity, had been built on the patronage of the man who had stolen his soul. He had been working for the architect of his own misery. "Where do you live, Lena?" Alejandro asked, his eyes burning with a dark, terrifying clarity. "Give me the exact apartment, the floor, the room." It's the Grey Gardens," she stammered. "Building C, apartment 302. But the elevator is broken and the stairs are dark. Please, the men there, they don't like strangers in suits. They'll think you're there to collect." "I am there to collect, Lena," Alejandro said, his hand moving to the door handle as the SUV began to slow, entering the skeletal, neon-lit maze of the flats. "But not money. I am there to collect the 20 years that were stolen from me." He looked at the delivery bag one last time. A $12 order of cold pasta and breadsticks. It was the most important shipment he had ever overseen. He reached out and gently patted Lena's hand, a gesture of awkward, unpracticed comfort. "You did well today, Lena. You found the one door in this city that was waiting for you." The motorcade came to a halt in front of a crumbling tenement that looked like a tombstone in the moonlight. The lead car's doors flew open, and tactical teams in silent gear spilled out, securing the perimeter with a lethal efficiency that made the local street dealers vanish into the shadows like smoke. Victor appeared at Alejandro's window, his hand on his holster, his face grim. "We're set, boss. Building C is secured, but you should know the power is out on the third floor. It's a mess in there." Alejandro didn't wait for the door to be opened for him. He stepped out into the humid, trash-scented air of the flats, the silver locket clutched in his hand. He looked up at the darkened windows of the third floor, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wasn't a kingpin tonight. He wasn't the man who owned Oakhaven. He was Elijah, the boy who used to bring his sister wild strawberries, and he was finally going to bring her home. "Stay with Victor," Alejandro commanded Lena, his voice soft but absolute. "I need to see her first. I need to make sure she knows she doesn't have to be a ghost anymore." Lena nodded, her eyes wide as she watched the most feared man in the city walk toward the rotting entrance of the tenement. She saw the way his shoulders, usually square and arrogant, were slightly hunched, as if he were carrying the weight of the entire building. She saw him disappear into the dark hallway, a shadow entering the shadows, and for the first time in her life, she felt like the before time might actually be real. As Alejandro climbed the narrow, debris-strewn stairs, the scent of the city faded, replaced by the smell of poverty he thought he had escaped, the scent of damp plaster, cheap disinfectant, and the metallic tang of old pipes. Every step was a journey through time. He reached the third floor, his tactical flashlight cutting a sharp, white path through the gloom. He stopped in front of door 302. The wood was warped, the paint peeling like sunburnt skin. He raised his hand to knock, but his knuckles hovered inches from the wood. He was terrified. He was more afraid in this moment than he had ever been during an ambush or a federal interrogation. What if she didn't recognize him? What if she hated him for the man he had become? What if the girl who loved wild strawberries had been completely erased by the ghost who lived in the flats? He closed his eyes, clutched the silver locket until the metal bit into his palm, and knocked. 3 short, rhythmic taps. The same signal they used to use as children to pass messages through the bedroom wall. Tab, tab, tab. From inside the apartment, a faint, ragged cough sounded. Then, a voice, thin, brittle, and layered with 20 years of exhaustion, whispered a single word that shattered the last of Alejandro Cortez's iron walls. "Alej." He didn't wait for another word. He kicked the door open, not with the violence of a raid, but with the desperation of a man breaking out of a tomb. He stepped into the flickering, yellow light of a single candle, and as he looked at the woman sitting on the edge of a thin mattress, he realized that the mistake of the delivery girl was the only thing that had ever been right in his life. The interrogation was over. The war was just beginning. The flickering candlelight in the cramped apartment did more than illuminate the hollowed features of the woman on the bed. It acted as a chemical catalyst, dissolving the present and dragging Alejandro backward through the suffocating layers of time. As he looked into Alina's eyes that were identical to the girl, on the doorstep, yet ancient with suffering, the peeling wallpaper of the flats vanished. The smell of medicinal alcohol and damp rot was replaced by the overwhelming, cloying scent of jasmine and overripe peaches. He was no longer a man of 48 in a tailored black suit. He was 25 again, standing in the blistering, white-hot heat of a June afternoon in 2004, back when the world was still vibrant, and his hands were not yet stained with the permanent ink of the syndicate. In 2004, the Cortez name didn't belong to a criminal empire. It belonged to a family trying to outrun their own shadows. Alejandro had been a young soldier then, arrogant and brimming with the dangerous confidence of a man who believed his loyalty to the Varga family made him untouchable. He remembered the way the sun had felt on his neck that day, a relentless, heavy weight that made the air shimmer over the cracked pavement of their neighborhood. They were at a street fair, a chaotic explosion of music, cheap fried dough, and the high-pitched screams of children on the tilt-a-whirl. Alina was 16, a whirlwind of energy in a sundress the color of a summer sky, her laughter rising above the din like a silver bell. She was wearing the locket. It had been his gift to her only days before, and she had spent the entire afternoon clutching it, her thumb tracing the willow branches just as his did now. "Stay close, Elle," he had told her, his voice light and teasing. He had felt like a king that day, flanked by two of Varga's low-level enforcers, his chest puffed out with the pride of his rising status. He thought he was the most dangerous man in the crowd. He thought his presence alone was a shield that could deflect the very sun. "You're so boring, Elijah," she had shouted back, her eyes dancing with mischief. "I'm just going to get a soda. I'll be 30 feet away. Stop acting like a bodyguard." That was the moment, the pivot point upon which the rest of his life would spin into darkness. He had laughed. He had reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crumpled bills and pressed them into her hand. "Make it 2, and don't talk to the boys by the stage." He watched her weave through the crowd, her blue dress a flickering spark against the sea of people. He watched her for 10 seconds, then 20. He saw her reach the vendor's stall. He saw her wave back at him, her smile radiant, her hand resting on the silver locket at her throat. Then his phone had buzzed. It was Silas Varga, the Crow, the man who had taken Alejandro under his wing after their father was gunned down in a warehouse fire. Varga's voice had been urgent, a low rasp that spoke of a shipment intercepted, of a crisis that required Alejandro's immediate attention at the edge of the fairgrounds. It was a distraction, a masterfully timed pull on the spiderweb. Alejandro had looked at Alina one last time. She was laughing at something the vendor said. She was safe. She was surrounded by hundreds of people in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. What could happen in 3 minutes? "I'll be right back," he muttered to his companions, stepping into the flow of the crowd. He had walked away. He had turned his back on the only person who truly loved him to serve the man who was currently selling her. He remembered the feeling of the gravel beneath his boots as he jogged toward the alley where Varga was supposed to be waiting. He remembered the sudden, eerie silence that seemed to fall as he moved away from the music, a vacuum of sound that should have been his first warning. When he reached the meeting point, Varga wasn't there. Only an empty street and a stray dog barking at the heat. He had waited 2 minutes, his irritation mounting, before his instinct finally screamed at him to run back. When he reached the vendor's stall, the blue dress was gone. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the sound of a plastic cup hitting the pavement. Alejandro stood in the center of the fair, the music suddenly sounding like a funeral dirge, the laughter of the children turning into a chorus of mocking shrieks. He called her name. He shouted until his throat burned, pushing through the crowds, grabbing strangers by the shoulders, demanding to know where the girl in the blue dress had gone. No one had seen anything. No one had heard a scream. In a crowd of 1,000 people, his sister had simply evaporated into the humid air. He remembered the days that followed as a blur of frantic, jagged edges. He had gone to Varga, weeping and broken, begging for the syndicate's resources to find her. Varga had sat in his leather chair, a look of profound, manufactured sorrow on his face, and promised that every soldier in the city would be looking for Alina. "We'll find her, Elijah," the Crow had whispered, placing a heavy, fatherly hand on Alejandro's shoulder. "Someone must have recognized the Cortez name. They're using her to get to us. We'll bring her home." But as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the trail went cold. Varga would bring him leads that led to dead ends, rumors of a girl matching her description in a shipping container in Port City, a grainy photograph of a woman in a brothel in a neighboring state. Each lead was a fresh twist of the knife, designed to keep Alejandro loyal, focused, and fueled by a vengeful rage that Varga directed toward their rivals. He told Alejandro that the Vargas enemies had taken her. He told him that the only way to save her was to make the Cortez syndicate so powerful that no one would dare keep her hidden. Alejandro had believed him. He had become the monster Varga needed. He had climbed the ranks by spilling oceans of blood, thinking that with every territory he seized, he was getting one step closer to the room where Elena was being held. He had embraced the darkness because he thought it was the only path to the light. He never realized that the man leading him through the labyrinth was the one who had built the walls. He remembered the specific night 3 years into the search when he had stood on a balcony overlooking the city and realized he was never going to find her. The guilt had settled into his bones then, a permanent, freezing chill. He had failed the only task that mattered. He had looked away. He had traded his sister's life for a phone call from a traitor. From that night on, he had stopped being Alejo. He had become the king of shadows, a man who ruled through fear because fear was the only thing that didn't feel like grief. Now, in the dim light of the apartment in the flats, the ghost of 2004 stood before him in the form of a woman who looked like she had been carved out of exhaustion. The blue dress was gone, replaced by a threadbare nightgown. The laughter was gone, replaced by a hollow, rattling cough. But as Elena looked up at him, her eyes widening as she recognized the man beneath the black suit, the 20 years of lies began to crumble. "You looked away," she whispered, her voice a fragile echo of the girl at the fair. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact that had defined both of their lives. "I looked away," Alejandro choked out, the words tearing through his throat. "I looked away and I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped, Elena." He saw her eyes drop to the silver locket in his hand. He saw her reach out, her fingers trembling as she touched the tarnished willow branches. In that moment, the heat of 2004 rushed back into the room, the scent of jasmine, the sound of the fair, the weight of the sun. He realized that Varga hadn't just stolen his sister, he had stolen his entire life. He had turned a protector into a predator and a victim into a ghost. The flashback receded, leaving Alejandro standing in the cold reality of the present. The man who had sent him into that fairgrounds 20 years ago was still out there, sitting in a mansion built on the profit of Elena's suffering. The syndicate he had spent his life building was the very cage that had held her. The air in the apartment felt heavy with the weight of the revelation. Alejandro Cortez was no longer just a man looking for his sister. He was a man who had realized that he had been the primary architect of his own tragedy. He looked at Elena, then at Lena, who was standing in the doorway, her red delivery cap a stark reminder of the mistake that had brought them here. The past wasn't dead. It was sitting on a thin mattress in the flats, breathing with a ragged, labored effort. And the man responsible for every second of that pain was about to find out that the boy who used to bring wild strawberries had grown up to be the most dangerous man in the world. "I'm here now," Alejandro said, his voice a low, vibrating promise that shook the very walls of the tenement. "And I am never looking away again." The war wasn't just coming, it was already here. And Alejandro Cortez was ready to burn the city of Oakhaven to the ground to ensure that the ghost of 2004 finally got to go home. The silence in the small apartment was heavy, a thick, suffocating veil that tasted of decades of dust and unvoiced prayers. Alejandro remained on his knees by the bed, the silver locket still clutched in his hand, its sharp edges pressing into his palm as if trying to draw blood. He looked at Elena, really looked at her, seeing past the gray pallor of her skin and the hollows beneath her eyes. Then he turned his head slowly toward the doorway where Lena stood. The girl was framed by the dark hallway, her red delivery cap cast in a sickly yellow glow from the single candle. The resemblance wasn't just a trick of the light or a desperate hope of a grieving man. It was a genetic echo. The way Lena tilted her head, the specific, defiant curve of her lower lip, it was a mirror of the girl who had disappeared in 2004. "She has your eyes, Alejo," Elena whispered, her voice a fragile rasp that seemed to cost her more than she had to give. She reached out a trembling hand, beckoning her daughter forward. "Lena, come here. Come closer to the light. Lena stepped into the room, her movements hesitant, her gaze shifting between the mother she adored and the man she had been taught to fear as a legend of the dark. As she moved into the center of the room, the reality of the situation hit Alejandro with the force of a tidal wave. He had spent 20 years imagining Alina's life as a void, a frozen moment in time. He had never considered the possibility of a legacy. He had never imagined that, while he was busy becoming a monster, a new life had been forged in the crucible of his sister's suffering. Lena, Alejandro breathed, the name suddenly tasting different in his mouth. It wasn't just a delivery girl's name anymore, it was a variation of Alina, a tribute, a memory kept alive in the very breath of a child. You are her daughter. Alina nodded, a single tear tracking through the deep lines of her face. She was born in the dark, Alejo, in one of those rooms with no windows. The crow, he didn't just take me. He tried to take her, too. He wanted to sell the next generation before she had even taken her first breath. Alejandro felt a surge of nausea so violent he had to steady himself against the edge of the mattress. The system he had protected, the trafficking routes he had ensured were clear of police interference, the warehouses he had leased to associates for logistics. It wasn't just an abstract business. It was the cage where his niece had been born. He had been the landlord of her nightmare. Every time he had looked at a spreadsheet of human assets and seen numbers instead of names, he had been looking at his own blood. The locket was all I had, Alina continued, her eyes fixing on the silver willow. When they took my clothes, when they took my name, I hid it. I swallowed it. I sewed it into the lining of my skin once. I told myself that as long as I kept it, I was still a Cortez. And when Lena was born, I put it around her neck while the guards were sleeping. I told her that it was a key, that one day it would lead her back to a man who would save us. She looked at Alejandro then, a look of profound, agonizing irony. I didn't know the man who would save us was the one who was running the city that kept us in cages. I heard your name, Alejo, over the years, in the whispers of the men who came and went. Don Cortez, the king of shadows. I prayed to God it wasn't you. I prayed that my brother was dead rather than a man who grew rich off the blood of girls like me. The words were a sentence of death for the man Alejandro used to be. The mahogany-lined study, the tailored suits, the gold watch, it was all revealed as the gilding on a tomb. He realized that Lena, at 22, had spent her entire life in the shadow of his empire, working double shifts for pennies while he sat on a throne built from the very profit that had been wrung out of her mother's life. The $12 food delivery wasn't a glitch. It was a cosmic correction, a collision of two worlds that were never supposed to touch. Alejandro looked at Lena, who was now standing by her mother's side, her hand resting protectively on Alina's shoulder. She looked at him with a mixture of dawning realization and a deep, justified resentment. She saw the wealth in his suit, the power in his posture, and the violence in the men waiting in the hallway. She saw the man who could have found them 20 years ago if he hadn't been so busy becoming a king. "You're the one," Lena whispered, her voice no longer trembling with fear but vibrating with a sharp, cold clarity. "You're the man from the stories, the one who owns the streets, the one who lets the landlords turn off the heat and the water. You're my mother's brother." "I am," Alejandro said, his voice a low, broken rumble. He stood up, his height dwarfing the small room, his presence suddenly feeling too large, too toxic for such a fragile sanctuary. He looked at his hands, hands that had ordered the very things that had broken the woman on the bed. "And I am the man who is going to burn every person who ever touched you, starting with Silas Varga." The name Varga caused Alina to shiver, a phantom pain radiating through her body. "He's still out there, Alejo. He still visits the collections. He told me years ago that if I ever tried to find you, he'd make sure you were the one who pulled the trigger on me. He made me believe you were the one who sold me. He said you traded me for your first seat at the table." Alejandro felt his pulse hammer against his temples. The lie was perfect. Varga had used Alina's disappearance to fuel Alejandro's rage, and used Alejandro's reputation to keep Elena in a state of perpetual terror. He had played them against each other for 2 decades, a master puppeteer of grief. The crow had fed on their misery until he was fat with power, while Alejandro had been his most loyal, most lethal dog. "He lied," Alejandro said, his eyes turning into chips of dark, incandescent ice. "He lied about everything, and he is going to pray for a death as slow as the life he gave you." He turned to the door, his jaw set in a way that signaled the end of the Cortez syndicate as the world knew it. "Victor." The head of security appeared instantly, his tactical light illuminating the hallway. He looked at the woman on the bed, then at the girl, then at the shattered expression on his boss's face. Victor had been with Alejandro for 10 years. He knew the history, but seeing the reality of it made even his hardened heart skip a beat. "We need the medical unit in here now," Alejandro commanded. "I want her stabilized. I want her moved to the private wing of the estate. If a single person sees her, if a single word of this leaks before I'm ready, I'll consider it a betrayal of the highest order. Do you understand?" "Yes, boss, we have the gurney ready. The route is clear." Alejandro looked back at Elena. "I'm taking you home, El, a real home, not a fortress, not a tomb, a place where the sun actually reaches the floor." He then looked at Lena. He saw the red delivery cap she was still holding, a symbol of her struggle and her mother's survival. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he pulled it back, feeling unworthy of the contact. "You don't have to deliver anything ever again, Lena. From this moment on, you are a Cortez, and the city of Oakhaven is going to find out exactly what that means." As the medical team moved in, their movements silent and professional, Alejandro stepped out into the dark hallway. The weight of the silver locket in his pocket felt like the weight of a world he was about to destroy. He realized that the heirloom's journey had finally ended, but his was just beginning. He wasn't just a brother anymore, and he wasn't just a boss. He was a man who had realized that he had been the primary villain in his own family's tragedy. He walked down the narrow, debris-strewn stairs of the tenement, his footsteps sounding like the tolling of a funeral bell. He stepped out into the humid air of the flats, looking at the black SUVs and the men in tactical gear. They were his tools, the instruments of his power. And tonight, he was going to use them to dismantle the very house they had built. Silas Varga was out there, sitting in a mansion built on the lives of girls like Elena, thinking he was the smartest man in the city. He thought he had turned Alejandro into a weapon that would never turn on its master. He thought the secret was buried deep enough to never see the light of day. But the light had arrived in the form of a $12 delivery. And as Alejandro Cortez watched the ambulance pull away with his sister and his niece inside, he knew that the syndicate's secret was no longer a ghost. It was a war, and he was going to make sure that the crow never saw another sunrise. The locket was back where it belonged. The family was reunited. Now the blood had to flow to pay for the 20 years of silence. Alejandro climbed into the lead car, his eyes fixed on the distant, glittering towers of the city center. "To Varga's estate," Alejandro said, "and tell the men tonight we don't take prisoners, we take everything." The motorcade roared to life, a black dragon of steel and vengeance tearing through the neon-lit maze of the flats. The mistake of the delivery girl was over. The reign of the King of Shadows was ending, and the man who had found his soul was about to show Oakhaven what a real monster looked like when he was fighting for the people he loved. The black leather interior of the command vehicle was a tomb of high-end electronics and suffocating realization. Alejandro Cortez sat in the rear, his face illuminated by the flickering, spectral blue light of a dozen monitors that hummed with the processing power of a mid-sized intelligence agency. For years, he had treated this digital surveillance suite as his greatest weapon, a godlike eye that allowed him to monitor the pulse of Oakhaven and snuff out threats before they manifested. But tonight, as the motorcade idled in the gutter of the flats, the screens didn't feel like power, they felt like a mockery. He had built a panopticon that could see everything except the one thing that mattered. He had spent millions to track ghosts across the Atlantic while the truth was breathing the soot-choked air of his own backyard. "Start the deep dive," Alejandro commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very chassis of the car. He didn't look at his head of security, Victor, nor did he look at the tactical teams waiting for orders. His eyes were fixed on a grainy, black-and-white still of Lena Morales captured from his own front gate camera only an hour prior. "I want every scrap of data on Lena Morales and her mother. Tax records, hospital visits, utility bills, expired IDs. I want to know every address they've touched in the last 20 years. If they breathed in this city, I want to see the carbon footprint." Across from him, a man known only as the Architect, a pale, hollow-eyed ghost of a hacker whose fingers moved with the frantic, skeletal grace of a spider, began to tear through the city's digital underbelly. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the clicking of keys and the distant, rhythmic thumping of a bass-heavy car stereo 3 blocks away. Alejandro watched as the search algorithms began to aggregate data, pulling from the legitimate world and the one he controlled. "Filtering by Morales," the Architect murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. "Zero hits on the locket or the name Elena in any recent database. But if we cross-reference the delivery app's driver profile for Lena, here, she's registered under an aunt's name, but her primary emergency contact is listed as EM at an address in the Grey Gardens." The screen flickered, and a digital map of Oakhaven appeared, a glowing grid of red and yellow. A single, pulsing dot appeared in the heart of the flats. Alejandro felt a cold, sharp contraction in his chest. The Grey Gardens wasn't just any slum. It was a sprawling, concrete labyrinth of a housing project that functioned as a tax haven for the syndicate. It was a place where the water was often brown, the elevators were death traps, and the police only entered in groups of 10. "Pull the deed," Alejandro said, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrest. "Who owns Building C of the Grey Gardens?" The Architect tapped a few more keys. A corporate filing appeared. "It's held by Vista Global Holdings, boss. It's a subsidiary of the Port Management Group." "And who owns Vista?" Alejandro asked, though he already knew the answer. It was a question he was asking the universe, a confirmation of the depth of the insult. "You do, Don Cortez," the Architect replied, his eyes finally flickering up to meet Alejandro. "Through the trust you established in 2012, you are the landlord." The realization hit Alejandro like a physical blow. He leaned back into the shadows, the blue light of the monitors casting deep, skeletal hollows into his face. For over a decade, he had been the man who signed the foreclosure notices. He had been the man who authorized the efficiency cuts that meant the heat stayed off in January and the security gates stayed broken. He had been the ultimate authority over the very roof that had sheltered, and slowly poisoned, his sister and his niece. While he was sitting in his mansion, drinking wine that cost more than their yearly rent, he had been the architect of their destitution. He hadn't just lost them, he had been the one crushing them under his heel, all while searching the world for their faces. "Trace the name on the lease," Alejandro whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans. "The lease for apartment 302 is under Maria Santos," the Architect said. "Established in 2005. Social Security number is a dead end, likely a forged document from the old Varga labs. She's been paying in cash for 20 years. No bank accounts, no credit history. She doesn't exist to the state, but she's been flagged 4 times in the last 3 years by the building's local collection team for late payments. The last note from the enforcer says, 'Tenant claims illness. Extended grace period denied. Eviction pending for the end of the month.'" Alejandro felt a roar of static in his ears, a psychic white noise that threatened to drown out his reason. The collection team for the Grey Gardens was a brutal branch of his own syndicate, managed by men who answered to the Varga lieutenants. They were his soldiers. They were his enforcers. And they were currently 20 days away from throwing his dying sister onto the street on his own orders. The paper trail wasn't just a path to discovery. It was a roadmap of his own crimes against his blood. "Find the medical records," Alejandro commanded, his jaw set in a way that made the muscles in his neck stand out like cables. If she's sick, she had to go somewhere. Search the free clinics. Cross-reference Maria Santos with respiratory ailments. The architect's fingers blurred across the keyboard. A new window opened. Found it. St. Jude's outreach. She's been seen 6 times in the last 6 months. Diagnosis: advanced pulmonary fibrosis, likely from prolonged exposure to black mold and industrial particulates. The notes from the doctor say the condition is exacerbated by poor living conditions and lack of consistent heating. She was prescribed oxygen, but there's no record of the prescription being filled. Likely couldn't afford the tank. Alejandro looked at the screen, at the cold, clinical words that described the slow destruction of his sister's lungs. He thought of the $12 food delivery. He thought of Lena working double shifts in the rain to buy medicine that couldn't possibly fix a building that was killing her mother. He thought of the locket, the silver willow that had stayed with Alina through every late payment, every eviction threat, and every night spent gasping for air in a room Alejandro owned. "The crow," Alejandro murmured, his eyes turning into chips of dark, incandescent ice. He knew. Silas Varga didn't just hide them. He put them in a place where he could watch them rot. He put them in my building so he could watch me walk past the truth every day without ever seeing it. It was a game to him, a 20-year joke. The architect stayed silent, but the air in the vehicle had changed. It was no longer the cool, sterile environment of a command center. It felt like the inside of a furnace. The weight of the discovery was a physical presence, a dark gravity that was pulling the entire syndicate toward a collapse. Alejandro realized that every cent of his wealth was tainted by the breath his sister couldn't take. Every territory he had won for Varga was a brick in the wall of Alina's prison. "Victor," Alejandro said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, crystalline lethality. "The men who manage the collections for the Grey Gardens, who are they?" "The Rixey brothers, boss. They've been running the flats for years. They report to Varga's nephew." "Bring them to me," Alejandro said. "I don't care if they're sleeping, eating, or bleeding. I want them in the warehouse in 30 minutes. And Victor, don't tell them it's about the girl. Tell them I'm happy with their efficiency and want to reward them personally." He looked back at the monitor, at the pulsing dot that represented the Grey Gardens. The paper trail was complete. He had the names, the dates, the medical codes, and the lease agreements. He had the full history of a betrayal that had been hidden in plain sight, buried under the bureaucracy of his own criminal empire. He had been the king of shadows, but he had finally realized that the shadows were made of his own sister's ghost. The mistake was no longer a mistake. It was a declaration of war. Alejandro reached out and touched the screen, his finger resting on the digital map of the slum he owned. He wasn't going to just save Alina and Lena. He was going to dismantle the world that had allowed them to suffer. He was going to burn the Vista Global Holdings and the syndicate and the Varga name until there was nothing left but the silver locket. "Architect," Alejandro said as he stood up, the movement heavy with a newfound, terrifying purpose. "Erase Maria Santos. Erase Lena Morales. Wipe every server, every cloud, every backup. If anyone tries to look for them after tonight, I want them to find nothing but a digital void. They are no longer tenants. They are no longer statistics." "Yes, Don Cortez," the hacker replied, his fingers already moving to execute the command. Alejandro stepped out of the command vehicle and into the humid, trash-scented air of the flats. He looked up at the moon, which was partially obscured by the smog of the city he thought he controlled. He felt a strange, cold peace settling over him. For 20 years, he had been a man looking for a reason to live. Tonight, he had found something much better, a reason to destroy. The paper trail had led him to the truth, and the truth had set his world on fire. "To the warehouse," Alejandro said to Victor, who was waiting by the door of the SUV. "And make sure the collection team understands. The King of Shadows is finished. Tonight they meet the brother." The motorcade roared to life. a black dragon of steel and vengeance tearing through the neon-lit maze of the flats. The mistake was over. The investigation was finished. And as the city of Oakhaven slept, Alejandro Cortez began the process of tearing his own kingdom apart to save the only two people who had ever mattered. The warehouse on the edge of the Oakhaven shipping district was a cathedral of rusted iron and cold secrets, a place where the syndicate's irregularities were smoothed over with silence or blood. Alejandro Cortez stood in the center of the loading bay, his tailored black suit absorbing the dim, flickering light of the overhead industrial lamps. The air here was thick with the scent of salt air, diesel, and the metallic tang of old grease. In front of him, the Rixey brothers, the men responsible for the collections at the Grey Gardens, sat bound to heavy steel chairs. They were still breathing hard, their faces a map of confusion and terror. They had expected a reward for their efficiency in clearing the slums. Instead, they had been dragged into the dark by the man they called Don. "You've done a fine job with Building C," Alejandro said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to make the very floorboards hum. He began to pace a slow, predatory circle around them, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the concrete. "Efficiency is up. Delinquency is down. You even managed to push a sick woman to the brink of eviction to maintain the quarterly margins. Silas Varga must be very proud of you." "Boss, we were just following the protocol," the older Rixey brother stammered, his eyes darting frantically. "Varga's nephew said the numbers had to stay green. We didn't know the woman was anything to you. We just thought she was another ghost in the flats." Alejandro stopped behind him, leaning down until his lips were inches from the man's ear. "That's the problem with ghosts, Antonio. They have a habit of haunting the people who made them. But I'm not here to talk about rent. I'm here to talk about the special logistics account, the one that doesn't show up on the main ledger, the one that funds the Crow's private interests." He signaled to the architect, who was stationed at a portable terminal in the shadows. A screen flickered to life on the wall, displaying a complex web of shell companies and offshore transfers. It was a digital map of a shadow empire within the syndicate. Alejandro had known about Varga's side businesses for years, but he had always looked away, assuming they were standard vice trades, smuggling, gambling, or high-end theft. He had been a fool. "The paper trail led to a very interesting discovery," Alejandro continued, his voice dropping into a register of pure, crystalline lethality. "The Grey Gardens isn't just a slum I happen to own. It's a filtration system. Varga has been using the tenants there, specifically the ones with no documentation, the ones who don't exist to the state, as a recruitment pool for a human trafficking ring that stretches from here to the border." The Rixey brothers went pale, a sickly gray color that matched the concrete. They knew. Alejandro could see it in the way their pupils dilated and their pulses hammered against their carotid arteries. "I looked into the Vista Global accounts," Alejandro said, his thumb tracing the silver willow of the locket in his pocket. "It turns out my business partners haven't been trading in narcotics or weapons. They've been trading in daughters. My mentors have been profiting from the exact trade that took my sister 20 years ago, and they've been doing it using my ships, my warehouses, and my protection." He walked to the terminal and pulled up a specific file. It was a ledger of inventory from 2004. He scanned the names until he saw a handwritten note next to a batch of IDs. EC Premium Asset Transfer to Varga Private Holding. The AC was Elena Cortez. Alejandro felt a roar of static in his brain, a psychic white noise that threatened to shatter his composure. He looked at the ledger and realized that Elena hadn't been taken by a rival family. She hadn't been a casualty of a stray bullet. She had been a business transaction authorized by Silas Varga. The man who had sat at Alejandro's table, the man who had promised to find her, had been the one who signed her over to a life of servitude. And for 20 years, he had allowed Alejandro to grow his power, knowing that every territory won was another layer of protection for the secret. "Who else knows?" Alejandro asked, turning back to the Rixai brothers. He didn't raise his voice, but the sheer weight of his presence made the younger brother let out a soft, whimpering sound. Which of my lieutenants are on the Varga payroll for this? If you lie to me, I will make sure the next 20 years of your lives make the Grey Gardens look like a palace. It's not just the lieutenants, boss, Antonio Rixai whispered, his voice cracking. It's the investors, the silent partners from the city council and the shipping union. They all get a piece of the special logistics. Varga told us it was the only thing that kept the syndicate untouchable. He said the money from the girls bought the kind of protection that blood never could. Alejandro felt a cold, familiar stone settle in his stomach. The syndicate wasn't just a criminal organization anymore. It was a parasitic organism that had hollowed him out from the inside. He had spent his life thinking he was the king of a kingdom, only to realize he was the guard of a graveyard. Every man he trusted, every hand he shook, was stained with the same filth that had ruined Alina's life. He looked at the screen again, at the list of inventory. He saw the names of dozens of other girls, many of whom had lived in the same buildings he owned. He saw the dates and the prices. It was a clinical, bureaucratic record of a Holocaust, and the syndicate's secret was that they were all complicit. By choosing to look away, by choosing to prioritize the stability of the organization over the morality of the trade, Alejandro had become the very thing he swore to destroy. "The crow thinks he's an architect," Alejandro murmured, his eyes turning into chips of dark, incandescent ice. "He thinks he's built a world where I'm just a weapon in his hand. He thinks he can hide the truth behind a mountain of gold and a sea of paperwork." He turned to Victor, who was standing by the warehouse doors, his hand on his holster, his face a mask of grim resolve. Victor had heard it all. He had seen the ledgers, and unlike the Rixai brothers, he didn't look afraid, he looked ready. "Victor," Alejandro said, "the special logistics hubs, I want them identified. Every warehouse, every safe house, every transport ship currently in the harbor, I want them purged. Not seized, purged. And the board, boss, the ones who have been taking the dividends." "The board is a collection of dead men who haven't realized it yet," Alejandro said. He walked over to the Rixai brothers and looked down at them. He saw the cowardice in their eyes, the same cowardice that had allowed Alina to rot in a room with no windows while they collected the rent. "You two are going to give the architect every name, every password, and every location you've ever touched for Varga. And when you're done, you're going to walk into the police station and confess to every crime you've committed in the last 20 years. If you miss even a single detail, I will find you." He didn't wait for their response. He turned and walked out of the warehouse, the humid night air of Oakhaven hitting him like a physical blow. He looked up at the moon, which was partially obscured by the industrial smog of the city he thought he controlled. He felt a strange, cold peace settling over him. For 20 years, he had been a man looking for a reason to live. Tonight, he had found something much better, a reason to destroy. The syndicate's secret was no longer a ghost. It was a roadmap for a massacre. Alejandro realized that he couldn't just save Alina and Lena. He had to burn the world that had allowed them to suffer. He had to dismantle the very house he had built, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but the truth. Silas Varga thought he had turned Alejandro into a monster that would never turn on its master. He was about to find out that the only thing more dangerous than a monster is a monster who has finally remembered his name. "To the Grey Gardens," Alejandro said as he stepped into the SUV. "I'm not leaving my sister in that place for another minute. And tell the men to get the heavy gear. We're going to war with the Crow." The motorcade roared to life, a black dragon of steel and vengeance tearing through the neon-lit maze of the shipping district. The mistake of the delivery girl was over. The investigation was finished. And as the city of Oakhaven slept, Alejandro Cortez began the process of tearing his own kingdom apart to save the family he never knew he had. The locket in his pocket felt like a burning coal, a reminder of the 20 years of silence that had finally been broken. He looked at the digital display on the dashboard. It was 2:14. By sunrise, the Cortez syndicate would be a memory and Silas Varga would be a ghost. The war had begun, and Alejandro Cortez was no longer the king of shadows. He was the brother, and he was coming for his pound of flesh. The corridor of the gray garden smelled of stagnant water, cheap bleach, and the metallic tang of a dying radiator. Alejandro moved through the gloom of the third floor like a shadow returning to a grave. His tactical team had already neutralized the security in the lobby, Varga's low-level thugs who had been playing cards near the broken mailboxes. But up here, in the silence of the residential hall, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic thud of Alejandro's heart. He stopped in front of door 302. The wood was warped, the paint peeling away in long, jagged strips that looked like scorched skin. He reached out and touched the number, his fingers tracing the rusted plastic. This was it, the center of the universe he had failed to protect. He didn't use the master key Victor had retrieved from the super's office. He didn't want to enter this room like a landlord or a ghost. He wanted to enter as a brother. He raised his hand, his knuckles hovering over the wood for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, and then he knocked. 3 short, rhythmic taps, a code from a childhood where the biggest threat was a rainy afternoon and a lack of wild strawberries. "Lena," a voice called out from behind the door. The sound shattered Alejandro's remaining defenses. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years, yet it was instantly recognizable, like a song from a dream he had been trying to remember for half his life. It was thin, brittle, and punctuated by a shallow, wheezing effort for air, but it was Elena. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges letting out a high-pitched mourning wail. The apartment was a single room that seemed to be shrinking under the weight of the poverty it contained. A single candle burned on a plastic crate, casting long, flickering shadows against walls stained with black mold. In the corner, on a mattress that sat directly on the floor, a woman was propped up against a mountain of threadbare pillows. She was wrapped in a faded blue shawl that might have once matched the dress she wore at the fair in 2004. Alejandro stepped into the light, and for a moment the air in the room seemed to freeze. He saw the woman's eyes widen, the same amber eyes he saw in Lena, the same eyes that looked back at him from the mirror every morning. She looked at his tailored black suit, his polished shoes, and the lethal grace of his posture. To her, he was the monster from the hill. The man whose name was whispered in the slums as the architect of their misery. "Don Cortez," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp. She tried to pull the shawl tighter around her, a reflexive gesture of protection. I don't have the rent. Lena is out, she's working. She'll have it by morning, I swear. Please don't take the door, not tonight." The words were a physical blow to Alejandro's solar plexus. He felt a surge of nausea, so violent he had to lean against the doorframe for support. His own sister was begging him for mercy, terrified that the man she didn't recognize as her brother was there to throw her into the street for a few $100s he didn't even need. He realized then that Varga's cruelty was absolute. He hadn't just hidden Elena, he had made her a victim of her own brother's empire. "Elena," he said, the name sounding like a prayer in the small, cramped space. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver locket, the willow branches glinting in the candlelight. "It's not about the rent." The woman's breath hitched, a jagged, rattling sound that made her entire frame shudder. She stared at the locket, her eyes filling with a sudden, overwhelming light. She looked up at his face, searching the hard lines and the cold, gray eyes of the Mafia boss for the boy she had once known. "Alejo," she whispered, the name a fragile thread of hope. "I'm here, Alejandro said, his voice breaking as he crossed the room and dropped to his knees beside the mattress. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched her shoulder. "I'm here. I finally found you." The reunion wasn't the cinematic embrace Alejandro had spent 20 years imagining. It was a collision of 2 broken people in the ruins of a life that had been stolen. Elena let out a soft, whimpering sob and collapsed into his arms, her weight almost non-existent. She felt like a bird made of glass and paper, her bones fragile beneath his hands. Alejandro held her, burying his face in her shoulder. The scent of her, faint lavender and industrial dust, triggering a cascade of memories that nearly overwhelmed him. "I thought you sold me," she cried into his chest, her fingers clutching the expensive wool of his jacket with a desperate, frantic strength. "The crow. He told me you traded me for a seat at the table. He said every time I saw your name on the news, it was a reminder of the price you got for my life. I've lived in your buildings, Alejo. I've seen your men beat people for $1. I thought you were the one who put me in the room with no windows." "I didn't know," Alejandro choked out, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "Elena, I swear to you on my soul I never stopped looking. Varga, he lied to both of us. He used me to build his kingdom while he kept you in the dirt. He's the one who took you from the fair. He's the one who's been profiting from your life." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. He saw the scars of her struggle, the fine lines of exhaustion, the gray tint to her skin from the failing lungs, and the deep, hollow sadness in her eyes. But beneath it all, she was still his sister. She was still the girl who loved wild strawberries. "He's going to pay, Elena," Alejandro said, his eyes turning into chips of dark, incandescent ice. "Every second of these 20 years is going to cost him a piece of his soul. I am going to burn his world to the ground. I am going to make sure the name Varga is a curse in this city." Elena shook her head, her hand moving to touch his cheek. "No, Alejo, don't go back into the dark for me. Look at what it's done to you. Look at your eyes. You're not the boy I remember. You're a man made of stone." "The stone is gone, El," he replied, his voice a low, vibrating promise. "The delivery girl, your daughter, she knocked on my door tonight. She brought me the locket. She brought me back to life. I'm not the Don anymore. I'm just your brother, and I'm taking you home." He looked around the room, seeing the reality of her life, the empty pantry, the cold radiator, the single candle. This was the paper trail in physical form. This was the result of 2 decades of syndicate efficiency. He stood up, his height dwarfing the small apartment, his presence suddenly feeling too large for the space. "Victor," he shouted, his voice echoing down the hallway. The head of security appeared in the doorway, his tactical light cutting a path through the gloom. He looked at the woman on the bed, then at the shattered expression on his boss's face, and he lowered his head in a gesture of profound respect. "Get the medical team in here," Alejandro commanded. "I want her moved now. I don't want another second of her life spent in this building. Do you understand?" "Yes, boss, the ambulance is at the curb. The route is secured." Alejandro turned back to Elena, helping her sit up. "Lena is downstairs. She's safe. She's going to be with you. From this moment on, you never have to worry about the rent or the heat or the crow ever again. You are under my protection, and the world is going to find out what that means." As the medical team moved into the room with a gurney, Alejandro stepped back into the shadows. He watched them lift his sister with a gentleness that felt entirely alien to the gray gardens. He saw the way she looked at him as they wheeled her out, a mixture of terror, relief, and a lingering, heartbreaking love. He walked behind them, his footsteps sounding like a funeral bell on the narrow stairs. He stepped out into the humid air of the flats, looking at the black SUVs and the men in tactical gear. They were the tools of his power, the instruments of the empire that had hidden the truth from him. He realized then that he couldn't just save Elena. He had to destroy the version of himself that had allowed this to happen. The locket in his pocket felt heavy, a silver anchor to a past he was finally reclaiming. He watched the ambulance pull away, its sirens silent but its mission absolute. He turned to Victor, who was waiting by the door of the lead SUV. "Varga is at his mountain estate tonight, isn't he?" Alejandro asked. "Yes, boss. He's hosting a dinner for the union leads." "Good," Alejandro said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, crystalline lethality. "He should have a last meal. Tell the men. We're not just going for a meeting. We're going for a reckoning. And tell them if anyone tries to stop us, they die where they stand." He climbed into the car, the luxury of the interior feeling like a mockery of the room he had just left. He looked at the digital display on the dashboard. It was 3:12 a.m. by sunrise. The Cortez syndicate would be a memory, and Silas Varga would be a ghost. The reunion was over. The war had begun. And Alejandro Cortez was no longer the king of shadows. He was the brother, and he was coming for his pound of flesh. The predator's greatest vulnerability is not a lack of strength, but the sudden growth of a conscience. As the black motorcade tore away from the crumbling remains of the Grey Gardens, the high-frequency vibrations of the Cortez syndicate began to shift from the low hum of order to the frantic screech of a machine tearing itself apart. Alejandro Cortez sat in the rear of the lead SUV, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the silver locket that lay open in his palm. He was a man who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of the cold-blooded calculation, but the math had changed. He was no longer protecting a territory or a profit margin. He was protecting a ghost who had regained her breath and a girl who had accidentally dismantled his world with a single knock. He knew the silence of the city was a lie. Oakhaven's underworld was a vast, interconnected nervous system, and he had just sent a massive jolt of electricity through its most sensitive nerves. By removing Alina and Lena from the flats, he hadn't just rescued his family. He had signaled to every traitor and every silent partner that the King of Shadows was no longer playing by the rules of the game. The syndicate didn't run on loyalty. It ran on the shared security of mutual secrets. And Alejandro, by reclaiming the very secret that Silas Varga had used to anchor his power, had become the greatest threat to the organization he had helped build. The first sign of the internal war didn't come in the form of a bullet. It came as a digital blackout. "Boss," the architect said from the front passenger seat, his fingers flying across a tablet that was suddenly flickering with red warning icons. "The encrypted channel for the South District lieutenants just went dark. I'm seeing massive data wipes on the Varga servers. They're purging the special logistics records and the GPS on the medical transport carrying your sister. It just dropped off the grid." Alejandro's pulse spiked, a cold, sharp needle of adrenaline piercing his heart. "What do you mean it dropped off?" "Signal jamming," the architect replied, his voice tight. "High-grade military tech. They're not just trying to hide their tracks, Alejandro. They're cutting the lines. They know you found her. And they know that as long as she and the girl are alive, they are the living evidence of a 20-year felony that would bury the entire board." Alejandro looked out the window. They were crossing the bridge into the industrial district, a wasteland of rusted cranes and hollowed-out warehouses. The world felt like it was closing in. He realized then that Varga wouldn't wait for a confrontation. To the syndicate, Alejandro was now compromised, an asset that had become a liability. In the clinical logic of the Crow, the most efficient way to stabilize the system was to remove the emotional anchor. If Lena and Alina were erased, Alejandro would have nothing left to fight for but ashes. "Victor," Alejandro said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, crystalline lethality. "The medical transport, where was the last ping?" "Second and Main, just before the tunnel," Victor said, his hand already on his weapon. "I have 2 cars with them, but if they're being jammed, they're blind. We're 4 minutes out." "Push it to 2, Alejandro commanded. The SUV roared, the engine screaming as it surged forward, weaving through the sparse late-night traffic with a desperation that bordered on suicidal. Alejandro gripped the door handle, his jaw set so tight it felt like granite. He thought of Lena, her bright red delivery cap, her tired eyes, and the way she had looked at him with a mixture of terror and hope. She had spent her life as a ghost in the flats, working double shifts to buy medicine for a mother he had helped keep in a cage. She was the only innocent thing left in his bloodline, and the very men who called him Don were currently moving to snuff her out to protect their dividends. The attack happened at the mouth of the tunnel. It wasn't a subtle hit. It was a tactical strike. A heavy-duty construction truck, reinforced with steel plating, swung out from a side street, slamming into the rear car of the medical detail. The sound of rending metal and shattering glass echoed through the concrete canyon. Alejandro watched through the windshield as the ambulance swerved, its tires screeching in a desperate attempt to maintain control. Two black sedans, unmarked but moving with the synchronized precision of syndicate hit squads, closed in on the ambulance from both sides. "Engage!" Alejandro roared. Victor didn't need the order. He leaned out the window, his submachine gun spitting a rhythmic, staccato chorus of lead. The lead SUV swerved, cutting between the ambulance and the attackers. Alejandro felt the impact of bullets against the armored plating of his door, a dull, rhythmic thudding that sounded like a giant knocking for entrance. He didn't flinch. He was no longer a man. He was a vengeful force of nature. The tunnel was a claustrophobic hellscape of strobe lights and screaming engines. The architect was frantically trying to bypass the jamming, his screen a mess of static and code. Alejandro watched as one of the hit squad cars pulled alongside the ambulance, the passenger window rolling down to reveal the muzzle of a weapon aimed directly at the rear doors where Lena was sitting. "Marco, ram them!" Alejandro shouted, but then he remembered his own rule. He had no Marco, no one left but his own will. He grabbed the steering wheel from the driver, jerking the heavy SUV into the side of the sedan. The collision was violent, a bone-jarring impact that sent the sedan spinning into the concrete wall of the tunnel. It erupted in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, but Alejandro didn't stop to watch. He straightened the SUV, his eyes fixed on the ambulance. He saw Lena's face for a split second through the rear glass, a pale, terrified mask of white in the darkness. She was screaming, her hands pressed against the glass. "They're coming from the front," the architect shouted. Two more cars had blocked the exit of the tunnel, their headlights blindingly bright. Alejandro realized then that this wasn't just a hit, it was a purge. The syndicate had realized that Alejandro was willing to burn the kingdom for the family, so they were going to burn the family to save the kingdom. He felt a surge of rage so intense it felt like his blood was turning into liquid fire. These were the men he had trained. These were the men who had eaten at his table. "Victor, take the wheel," Alejandro commanded. He reached into the floorboard and pulled out a heavy tactical rifle, checking the chamber with a click that sounded like the closing of a coffin lid. "I'm ending this now." He kicked the door open before the SUV had even come to a full stop. He stepped out into the middle of the tunnel, a shadow in a black suit standing against the glare of the enemy headlights. He didn't seek cover. He didn't hesitate. He began to move forward, the rifle barking in his hands, each shot a calculated, lethal response to a 20-year betrayal. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace, a man who had finally found the one thing worth dying for. He saw the faces of the men he was killing, men he had known for a decade, and he felt nothing but a cold, clinical satisfaction. They weren't soldiers. They were the guards of the cage that had held Elena. They were the ones who had profited from the silence. As he reached the ambulance, he saw Lena crouched on the floor, her arms wrapped around her mother's prone form. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a horror that was no longer directed at him, but at the world he represented. "Stay down," Alejandro shouted, his voice a roar that drowned out the sirens and the gunfire. He turned back to the remaining attackers, his eyes burning with a dark, incandescent fire. He was the king of shadows, and tonight he was showing Oakhaven why that title had been earned in blood. He dismantled the final hit squad with a surgical precision that left the tunnel silent, save for the hissing of steam from broken radiators and the distant, fatting echoes of the battle. He stood in the center of the wreckage, his suit torn, his face splattered with the red ink of the syndicate's collapse. He looked at the ambulance, then at the smoking remains of the cars that had tried to take his niece's life. He realized then that there was no going back. The internal war had officially begun, and there would be no peace until one of them was in the ground. He walked to the back of the ambulance and pulled the doors open. Lena was trembling, her hand clutching the silver locket that Alejandro had returned to her. She looked at the carnage in the tunnel, then back at him. Why are they doing this? She whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. Because they are afraid of the truth, Lena, Alejandro said, his voice dropping into a low, steady register. He reached out and gently touched her hair, his hand shaking with a sudden, violent emotion. And they are right to be afraid, because I am going to burn every one of them to the ground. He turned to Victor, who was standing by the wreckage, his weapon still raised. Change the destination. We're not going to the estate. It's compromised. We're going to the safe house in the North End, the one Varga doesn't know about. Boss, that place hasn't been used in years, Victor protested. Exactly, Alejandro said. It's the only place in this city where the Crow can't see us. And Victor, call the remaining loyalists. Tell them the syndicate is dead. Tell them the king is gone. Tonight we fight for the family. As the motorcade, now a battered, smoking remnant of its former self, limped out of the tunnel and into the cold night air of the North End, Alejandro sat in the back of the ambulance, his hand resting on Alina's pulse. He looked at Lena, who was finally beginning to stop shaking. He realized then that he had lost his kingdom, his wealth, and his status. He was a man with a target on his back and a city that wanted him dead. And for the first time in 20 years, Alejandro Cortez felt completely, terrifyingly free. The internal war wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a purge of his own soul. He had spent his life building an empire of fear, but he was going to spend the rest of it building a sanctuary of justice. He looked at the silver locket one last time before closing it. The mistake of the delivery girl had been the only thing that had ever been right. And as the city of Oakhaven slept, the most dangerous man in the world began the process of tearing down the very sky to make sure his niece never had to look behind her again. The safe house in the North End was a skeletal structure of concrete and cold intent, a relic of a time before Alejandro had traded his soul for the gilded cage of a mansion. But as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting a jaundiced yellow light over the industrial wasteland, it was the only fortress left that didn't feel like a trap. Inside, Alina was hooked to a portable oxygen concentrator, her breathing a ragged, mechanical rhythm that served as the metronome for Alejandro's rage. Lena sat by her mother's side, her red delivery cap resting on a nearby crate, a splash of vibrant, innocent color in a room that smelled of gun oil and old stone. Alejandro stood at the window, watching the street through the slats of reinforced blinds. He was no longer the king of shadows who moved with calculated, boardroom precision. He was a man who had been hollowed out by the truth, and in that vacuum, a prehistoric violence had taken root. Victor, Alejandro said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that barely rose above the hum of the concentrator. The board. I want to know where they've gone to ground. Victor stepped into the light of the single flickering bulb, his face bruised and his tactical vest torn from the tunnel ambush. They're panicking, boss. Silas Varga has called an emergency conclave at the vineyard, the old winery. He's telling the lieutenants that you've lost your mind, that you're a danger to the stability of the trade. He's offering a $10 million bounty on you and double that for the girl and her mother. He wants them erased before the feds can find a reason to look into the special logistics records. Alejandro felt a cold, sharp smile pull at the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a man who had already seen his own ghost. 10 million. Varga always was a cheap bastard. He thinks money can buy loyalty in a house that's already on fire. He turned away from the window, his eyes turning into chips of dark, incandescent ice. The syndicate was built on my back, my ships, my roots, my soldiers. Varga thinks he's the architect, but I'm the one who laid the bricks. And tonight, I'm going to pull the foundation out from under him. He walked over to the table where a map of Oakhaven lay spread out. He didn't look at the territories or the docks. He looked at the logistics hubs, the nodes of the trafficking ring that had stolen his sister's life. We don't go for Varga first, Alejandro commanded. We take away his heir. I want every warehouse, every safe house, and every transport hub in his private network burned to the ground. I want the inventory released. If any of his men try to stop us, show them no mercy. They chose their side 20 years ago. The kingpin's wrath began not with a roar, but with a series of silent surgical strikes. Alejandro didn't send his men to do the work. He led them. He traded his tailored black suit for tactical gear that had been gathering dust, the weight of the rifle in his hand feeling like a natural extension of his own fury. He moved through the city like a vengeful shadow, a man who knew every shortcut, every blind spot, and every secret door. The first target was the distribution center in the port, a nondescript building that functioned as the primary holding cell for Varga's special logistics. Alejandro arrived with the force of a hurricane. He didn't wait for a parley. He didn't offer a choice. He kicked the doors open and stepped into the sterile, fluorescent light of the warehouse. The men inside, soldiers he had known for years, froze at the sight of him. They saw the blood on his face and the darkness in his eyes, and they realized that the man they had feared as a boss was now something far more terrifying, a brother with nothing left to lose. Don Cortez, one of the younger guards, shouted, his hand hovering over his holster. "You shouldn't be here," Varga says. Alejandro didn't let him finish. He moved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace, the rifle barking in his hands. He wasn't just clearing a room, he was purging a sickness. He moved through the warehouse, dismantling the security detail with a clinical precision that left the floor littered with the red ink of the syndicate's collapse. He reached the rear of the building, where a series of heavy, windowless doors stood. He felt a surge of nausea as he recognized the architecture. This was the room Elena had described. The room with no windows. He tore the doors open, and for a second the air in the warehouse felt like it had been sucked into a vacuum. Inside were 12 girls, their eyes wide with a terror that broke Alejandro's heart. He looked at them and saw Elena. He saw Lena. He saw the 20 years of silence that he had allowed to persist. "You're free," Alejandro whispered, his voice a low, vibrating promise. "Go, my men are outside. They will take you to a safe place. The crow is finished." As the girls fled into the night, Alejandro stood in the center of the room and doused the walls in accelerant. He struck a match and watched as the embers caught, the orange light reflecting in his eyes. He didn't feel a sense of triumph. He felt a profound, lingering shame that it had taken him this long to see the truth. This was his empire. This was his legacy, and he was going to burn every inch of it until the name Cortez was synonymous with nothing but ash. The night became a blur of fire and lead. Alejandro moved from target to target, a one-man warpath that left the syndicate's leadership in a state of absolute paralyzed terror. He hit the counting houses, the private docks, and the safe houses where Varga's board members were hiding. He didn't take prisoners. He didn't ask for explanations. He was the kingpin's wrath, a force of nature that was systematically dismantling the very organization that had sustained him. By 3:00 a.m., the syndicate's financial and physical infrastructure was in ruins. The special logistics was gone. The board members were either dead or in flight, and Silas Varga was alone in his winery, waiting for the end. But the war wasn't over. As Alejandro returned to the North End safe house to check on Lena and Elena, he found Victor waiting for him at the perimeter. The large man's face was grim, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "They found the apartment, boss," Victor said, his voice a low, steady vibration. "Not this safe house, but the apartment in the flats. Varga's cleansing squad went there to make sure no evidence was left behind. They're burning the whole block. They think they can erase the history if they just burn the building." Alejandro felt a surge of rage so intense it made his vision turn white at the edges. The gray gardens, the room where Elena had lived for 20 years, the place where Lena had grown up. Varga wasn't just trying to kill them, he was trying to erase their existence. He wanted to make sure that when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but a story that no one would believe. "Is Lena safe?" Alejandro asked, his hand gripping the barrel of his rifle until the metal groaned. "She's inside, boss. She's with her mother, but she knows. She saw the news." Alejandro stepped into the safe house, his boots sounding like a funeral bell on the concrete floor. He found Lena standing in the center of the room, her eyes fixed on a small television that was showing footage of the fire in the flats. The Grey Gardens was a towering inferno, the red flames licking the sky like the tongues of a demon. Lena looked at him, and for a second the resentment was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out grief. "Everything we had," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. "The letters, the pictures, the only things that proved we were real. He's burning it all." Alejandro walked over to her and gently took the red delivery cap from her hand. He looked at it, then back at her. "He can burn the building, Lena. He can burn the papers and the walls, but he can't burn the locket, and he can't burn me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the silver willow, placing it in her palm. "He thinks he's erasing his crimes. He doesn't realize he's just giving me a reason to make sure he never sees the sun again." He looked at Alina, who was watching him with a mixture of terror and a lingering, heartbreaking love. She knew what he was about to do. She knew that her brother was going to finish the work he had started 20 years ago. "I have to go, Alina," Alejandro said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, crystalline lethality. "I have to finish this, for you, for Lena, and for the boy who looked away at the fair." "Alejo, please," Alina whispered, her hand reaching out to touch his sleeve. "Don't become him. Don't let the crow take the last of you." "The crow already took the last of me 20 years ago, Alejandro replied. "What's left is just the shadow, and shadows are the only thing that can survive in the dark." He turned and walked out of the safe house, his jaw set in a way that signaled the end of the syndicate's world. He climbed into the SUV, the engine roaring to life with a desperate, frantic energy. He looked at the digital display on the dashboard. It was 4:12. The vineyard was 30 miles away. By sunrise, the King of Shadows would be a memory and Silas Varga would be a ghost. The warpath was complete. The Kingpin's wrath had cleared the way. Now there was only the reckoning. "To the vineyard," Alejandro said to Victor, "and tell the men, I don't want a fight, I want an execution." As the car tore through the neon-lit maze of the industrial district, Alejandro Cortez sat in the back, his eyes fixed on the silver locket in his mind. The mistake of the delivery girl had been the only thing that had ever been right. And as the city of Oakhaven slept, the most dangerous man in the world began the process of tearing down the very sky to make sure his niece never had to look behind her again. He had lost his kingdom, but he had found his soul, and he was going to make sure the price of that soul was paid in full. The heavy, iron-scented fog of the morning after a war hung low over the North End, clinging to the damp pavement like a shroud. It had been exactly 24 hours since the bloodbath at the vineyard, the night the Cortez Syndicate, a machine of fear that had ground the city under its gears for decades, finally choked on its own secrets and died. The silence that gripped the streets of Oakhaven was not the peaceful quiet of a new day, but the shell-shocked stillness that follows a hurricane. In the back alleys and the high-rise boardrooms, the name Alejandro Cortez was no longer spoken as a title of power. It was whispered as a ghost story, a warning of what happens when a man decides to burn his own kingdom to ash just to save a single spark of light. Alejandro walked down the narrow, debris-strewn alley toward the safe house, his footsteps heavy but steady. He was no longer the King of Shadows. The tailored black suit was gone, replaced by a worn leather jacket and a plain dark shirt. The gold signet ring, the symbol of his cold authority, lay somewhere in the charred ruins of the Varga estate. His face, once a mask of impenetrable stone, was now a map of exhaustion and relief. There were fresh scars on his knuckles and a deep, jagged cut across his cheekbone, but his eyes, those gray, flinty eyes that had seen 20 years of darkness, looked different. For the first time since June of 2004, they were clear. The static of the guilt, the roar of the suppressed grief, and the weight of the lies had finally been silenced. He stopped in front of the reinforced door of the safe house. He didn't check the perimeter sensors, and he didn't signal to a hidden tactical team. There was no one left to signal. Victor and the few loyalists who had survived the night had been given their final orders and enough untraceable cash to disappear into lives of their own. Alejandro was alone, and he had never felt more substantial. He was no longer a spider in the center of a web. He was just a man standing in the morning mist, holding a plain brown paper bag. He knocked 3 short rhythmic taps. The door opened almost immediately. Lena stood there, her red delivery cap nowhere to be seen, her hair loose and messy around her tired face. She looked at Alejandro, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. She didn't see the Mafia boss who had terrified her on his doorstep. She saw the uncle who had waded through a river of fire to find her mother. She saw the blood on his collar, and the way his hands shook slightly as he held the bag, and the last of her resentment, the anger at the 20 years of silence, seemed to dissolve in the cool morning air. "Is it over?" Lena whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "It's over, Lena," Alejandro replied, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that carried the weight of a final truth. "The crow is gone. The syndicate is ash. There is no one left to look for you, no one left to keep you in the dark." He stepped into the small, concrete room. Elena was awake, propped up against the pillows, her breathing finally steady thanks to the high-grade medical equipment Alejandro had secured during the purge. She looked at her brother, and a small, watery smile touched her lips, a smile that reached across 2 decades of suffering to find the boy she had once swung with from a willow tree. Alejandro walked over to the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress, the movement heavy with a profound, lingering weariness. "I brought a delivery," Alejandro said, his voice cracking with a sudden, sharp emotion. He placed the plain brown paper bag on the small table beside the bed. It wasn't a $12 order of pasta. It wasn't a transaction. He reached inside and pulled out a stack of documents, the deeds to a quiet estate in the countryside, far beyond the reach of the Oakhaven smog, along with new identities and trust funds that would ensure Lena and Elena never had to work a double shift or miss a meal ever again. It was a life, a real one, built on the wreckage of the one that had been stolen. Then he reached into the bottom of the bag and pulled out the silver locket. He had spent the previous hour in the back of a car, using a jeweler's cloth to polish away 20 years of tarnish and soot. The silver willow branches now glinted with a brilliant, mirror-like sheen, reflecting the soft light of the morning. The name, Elena, and the date 2004 stood out in sharp, clean relief. He held it out to his sister, his hand no longer the hand of an executioner, but the hand of a brother who had finally kept his word. "I promised I would always find you," Alejandro whispered. "It took me too long. I was lost in the shadows, El. I became the thing I was trying to save you from, but I'm back now, and I'm never looking away again." Elena took the locket, her thin fingers closing around the warm metal. She pulled it to her chest, her eyes closing as she let out a long, shuddering breath. "You found us, Alejo. That's all that matters. You brought the light back." Alejandro looked at Lena, who was standing by the window, watching the sun finally break through the industrial haze. He saw the potential in her, the life that was no longer a desperate scramble for survival, but a blank canvas. He had burned the world to give her that canvas. He had dismantled an empire to make sure that the mistake of her delivery was the last one she ever had to make. "There's a car waiting 2 blocks away," Alejandro said, standing up. He felt the gravity of the room pulling at him, the urge to stay and bask in the warmth of the family he had finally reclaimed. But he knew he couldn't. He was still a man with too much blood on his hands to sit at their table. The King of Shadows could be retired, but the consequences of his reign would always be a step behind him. To stay with them was to put a target on their backs. To love them truly, he had to leave them behind. "The driver is a good man. He'll take you to the house. The doctors are already there. You'll have everything you need." "You're not coming with us?" Lena asked, turning away from the window. There was no fear in her voice now, only a quiet, heartbreaking disappointment. "I have one last delivery to make," Alejandro said, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "To the city. I have to make sure the fires I started don't go out until every secret is burned. I have to be the shadow one last time so you can live in the sun." He walked over to Lena and gently took her hand. He didn't kiss her cheek and he didn't offer a dramatic goodbye. He simply looked at her with an intensity that burned the memory of her face into his soul. "Take care of her, Lena, and take care of yourself. You are a Cortez. Remember that. Not because of the money or the name, but because you survived the dark without becoming it." He turned back to Alina, who was watching him with a profound, lingering love. "Goodbye, Alijo," she whispered. "Goodbye, El," he replied. He walked out of the safe house and into the humid morning air, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He walked through the industrial district, the sound of his own footsteps the only accompaniment to the dawning of a new Oakhaven. He saw the black smoke rising from the distant horizon where Varga's winery had once stood, a funeral pyre for the syndicate. He saw the first delivery trucks of the day beginning their rounds, their bright colors a stark contrast to the gray concrete. Alejandro Cortez disappeared into the night, or rather, into the bright, unforgiving light of a morning he had never expected to see. He had burned an empire to become the brother he had promised to be in 2004. He had traded his crown for a silver locket and his wealth for a niece's safety. As he walked toward the city center, his silhouette fading into the mist, the final delivery was complete. He wasn't the boss and he wasn't the kingpin. He was just Alijo. And for the first time in 20 years, the boy who looked away at the fair was finally, completely at peace. The city of Oakhaven would rebuild. New names would rise and new shadows would fall. But in a quiet house far to the north, a woman would wear a silver locket and a girl would look at the sun without fear, knowing that somewhere in the dark, they had a guardian who had given up everything just to hear a knock on the wrong door. Alejandro had lost his kingdom, but he had found his soul, and in the grand ledger of his life, it was the only transaction that had ever made him truly rich. He faded into the fog, a man who had finally delivered himself from the dark. The war was over, the brother had returned, and the locket was finally clean.